I've got lots of small offcuts of pallet wood left over from the pallet shed build that I did a few months ago. I wanted to find a use for them, so I've come up with a design for a hexagon cat house. Dylan. Most of the offcuts of pallet wood that I have are about 25 centimeters long, 8 centimeters wide and 18 millimeters thick. But I'll need to cut a 30-degree angle on each end, so they'll end up being about 22 centimeters long. By arranging these pieces as a hexagon, I should be able to create a shape that's around 38 centimeters in diameter, which should be a good size for the cat house. Because the pieces are 8 centimeters wide, I think I'll need to stack them 5 layers high, which will make the house around 40 centimeters tall. There are 6 sides to a hexagon, and 6 times 5 is 30. So that's how many pieces I will need to make to form the sides of the hexagon. I started by tilting my miter saw blade to 30 degrees. I trimmed one end of each piece at this angle. Then I measured and made a mark for the length. I flipped the piece over, lined up the miter saw blade with the mark, and then added a stop block to the fence. This would ensure that each piece I cut will be exactly the same length. I eventually ran out of shorter pieces, but I always have some longer pieces of pallet wood kicking around, and for those I could first make a 30-degree cut on the end, then flip it and push the piece up to the stop block, make the cut, flip it again for the next cut, and so on. And eventually I had the 30 pieces I'd need to make the sides. Next I ripped each of the pieces on the table saw to get them all to the consistent width of 8 centimeters. Then I sanded down both faces of each piece on the belt sander. I didn't sand too much as I wanted to keep the character in the wood, the nail holes and the dents, but I did want to make them more smooth. Then I'd put a 45-degree chamfer along both edges of what would be the outside faces of each piece using a block plane. This would just add a bit of extra detail to the design to make the hexagon house look more interesting and also hide the glue joints. Next I needed to cut some internal upright pieces to reinforce the 60-degree miter joints. I tilted my table saw blade to 30 degrees and used some scrap lengths of pine that I had laying around, which measured 45mm by 35mm. I set the fence a couple of centimetres away from the blade, made a rip cut, then flipped the piece and made the second cut. Then I needed to chop the upright pieces to the right length, which would be roughly the height of the hexagon house but a bit less, so I cut them to 38 centimetres. I made 6 of these, one to support each internal angle. Then it was time to assemble using glue and brad nails. Because my electric nailer is a piece of junk, I then had to hammer in the brad nails flush with the wood. I have recently invested in an air nailer, but I didn't have it at the time of making this video. Then I could add the next layer of pieces, and so on. Now in hindsight, what I've realised would have been an easier way to glue this up would have been to lay each piece face down, end to end onto some tape, add glue to the joints, and then use the tape to pull it together into the hexagon shape, and then I could have added the uprights for strength later on. But I didn't do that, and it turned out okay anyway. Before adding the final layer, I started working on the top. I'd used more pallet wood for this. I rotated my miter saw bed to 30 degrees and made a cut. I then offered this up to the top of the hexagon, leaving a couple of centimetres overhang around the outside edge, and made a mark to indicate where the next cut would need to be. With the first piece cut to size, I could then cut another 30-degree angle on the next piece of wood and offer it up to the first piece and mark it up for size. I made the cut for the second piece. And then I could mark out around those first two pieces onto another length of pallet wood and cut them out to give me 4 pieces. And then all I needed was a centerpiece, so I positioned the other 4 pieces with equal overhang all the way around the edges and then measured up the gap in the center. I could then rip another piece of pallet wood to that width and mark up the angles for the ends by offering it up to the other pieces. Then I could make the first cut on the centerpiece using a stop block at the end of the workpiece and flip it for the second cut, move the stop block along and do the same again so that it would be perfectly symmetrical. That all fitted well, so I made some marks on the top just so that I knew what order they were in and which way up they were. I chamfered the edges on these pieces that would make up the top panel as I had earlier for the pieces that made up the sides. Then I glued and weighed them down with some heavy things. After 4 hours or so, I came back and wanted to add some cleats to reinforce the top panel. I used the offcuts from the upright pieces to make the cleats and cut them to size on the bandsaw. Then I could glue and screw them from the inside through to the top panel. Next I chamfered the outside edges of the top panel with the block plane. And then I could add the final layer of side pieces. I made a bottom panel for the hexagon house the same way as I had made the top, only this time I screwed them in from the bottom as these screw heads wouldn't be seen. I chose which face of the hexagon I wanted to cut the entrance hole in, and then used a dish to mark up the shape. Then I could drill a hole with a Forstner bit so that I could get my jigsaw blade inside and cut out the circle. Next I took an old Stanley knife blade and scraped away any glue that was on the chamfered edges so that it wouldn't affect the finish that I add later. I hammered in all of the nails with a nail punch so that they would sit below the surface of the wood. Next I could sand the whole thing with my belt sander using a 120 grit paper. I also used my electric file to sand the entrance hole. And did a bit of hand sanding too. And then I sanded the whole thing with my orbital sander. I hoovered up any dust. Then I could apply the finish. I chose this Brie Wax Rustic Pine. I applied it with a brush so that I could get into all of the nooks and crannies. After a couple of hours, I could then buff up the finish to a nice sheen. That was the cat house finished, and I put a t-shirt that I'd been wearing inside the Hexagon house so that my cat would find the scent familiar. It's a good trick for getting them used to new places. The first night he ventured inside but came out again soon after. But the next day he eventually settled down inside. I think he likes it. This Hexagon will also be useful as an occasional extra seat. When the cat's not using it, that is.